So, and the next speaker would be Forrest Young. He's been known in the business for a very long time. He's been collecting animals, or he's the owner of the company Dynasty Marine in Florida, and he has 35 years experience of collecting animals and shipping animals, and he's giving a talk today about collection and transportation of Atlantic tunas. So, let's see. Yeah, right, let me help.
Thank you. Bless you out there. We live in a very exciting time to be an aquarist. I think in no other time in our profession has there been the opportunity to capture and display more new species than exist at this time, and it has been one of my life's passions to be able to pursue new species and develop new species as husbandry candidates. For those of you that don't have a 20 or 30 million liter aquarium, this is an ideal species in that this can be maintained in a much smaller aquarium venue that is probably far more common than our huge oceanarium colleagues have. The contents of my presentation are the capture of the tunas, the collection technique itself, early captive husbandry, feeding and acclimation, transport, post-transport husbandry, and other challenges, and of course the conclusions and acknowledgments. In order to capture the small tunas, we used a standard sport fishing technique called spinning tackle, which is common throughout the U.S., Europe, and I imagine the rest of the world. We use both artificial baits in the form of trolling lures and natural baits in the form of live pilchers and other small cut baits. The fish are attracted to the top of an underwater seamount about 30 kilometers offshore, and when we catch we lift them into the live well without any contact to the fish's skin, and one of my colleagues asked me, well, how do you do that? Well, we have a little hook device that we run down along the line, and it reaches the bend in the hook, and we turn the hook upside down, and since the hook is barbless, the fish drops off into the live well with no contact whatsoever, which is essential for most of the pelagic fishes that you work with, including the tunas and coryphena, for example. In the live well itself, we transported a total of 6 to 8 fish, depending on our fishing luck and the availability. In this case, we're all blackfin tuna, and we kept them in the live well for a maximum of about 4.5 hours, and this included the fishing time, which can vary from 1 to 2 hours to and sometimes it can be nearly all day and you don't catch anything, in a 2.5 meter diameter well in from the sea. It's significant to note that the 2.5 meter well weighs about 3,500 kilos, so you need a fairly large boat to handle that mass of water, and you need to be very careful when you're carrying that much mass at sea. We also used a 2.5 meter diameter container to transport the animals from our dock, which is remote from our facility, and that transport by road is about 15 minutes, and often can be the most challenging part of the transport because the fish are more stressed in that scenario. They've already been handled twice by this point in time, and our primary goal is then getting them into the holding facility. We used a 2.5 meter diameter tank as well to transport the fish to the location that I'll describe here later. There's the mouse. Worked before, there we go. So this is an example of what they look like. They're young of the year, they grow very fast, and you can see the extremely large pectoral fins, which aid them in a great deal of mobility. These guys are about this long, and they grow to a maximum size of about 10 to 12 kilos, which makes them ideal for a tank in the 500,000 to 1 million liter category, which most of you have. We were intentionally collecting them small so that they were more easily transported, and I'll go into the various details later of that, but small size is often far better for the transportation of pelagic animals, including the elasmobranchs, up to and including Manta birostris. Early captive husbandry. Smaller tuna of 1/2 to 1.5 kilograms survive fairly well in the existing hold'em systems that we use for small pelagic sharks and other small pelagic teleos. Larger fish at 3 to 4 kilos had more frequent, longer-term issues, colliding with each other and damaging each other in that process. Quite a few of the larger tuna in previous work had broken jaws and head damage, eye damage from tuna-to-tuna impacts during feeding collisions. This comprised the greatest portion of the mortality that we had with working with larger blackfin tuna, larger skipjack, and then larger bonito or little tuni, as are more correctly known. All of these fish are extremely sensitive to handling and capture trauma, and so at any time we do not ever touch this fish with our hands in any form of husbandry. All of the handling is done with water inside a plastic bag or a plastic stretcher. All of the fish we captured were feeding within 7 to 10 days of capture, and need to feed multiple times per day, and are initially very finicky about the food they eat. They don't eat right away. It takes a certain period of acclimation to get them used to eating on dead supplied foods. Based on their high energy budget, we feel they would do poorly if they were fasted prior to transport, which is the norm for most of the fish that we transport as well. So due to the other eccentricities that they have, they require very high water quality and a significant swimming space. Since tunas are very challenging to acclimate to feeding activity, we have clearly determined it's best to acclimate them fully to feeding before any attempted transports. In the wild, they prefer eating small silvery fishes, live swimming fishes, and are very fussy about the size of the food and the manner in which it is presented. Our previous work suggested that skipjack tuna and bonito fed more readily than blackfin tuna. However, these collections were dedicated strictly at blackfin tuna at the request of the client. After acclimation, it became readily apparent to us that they were eager to accept larger foods than they would initially eat without the same degree of selectivity. The best results that we achieved were achieved by feeding small fillets of small and medium fish like pilchards and small scads from about 2 centimeters to a maximum of 5 centimeters. The sink rate of the food, it was important for that to be as slow as possible to increase the contact time with the schooling fish as they swim past the food. It is also critical that they have access to floating food because tunas absolutely refuse to pick up foods off the bottom of the tank. Our tank was relatively small for pelagic fish, but it was the only tank that we had. We did this project in a total of 65 days, so we had to utilize the space that we had available. Since the tank was only 4.8 meters in diameter and 75 meters deep, the sink rate of the food greatly determined the individual availability of that piece of food. Had we had a deeper tank, I think that this would have been less of an issue. If we would have had 1.5 meters or 2 meters depth, I think it would have been less of a problem, and I would certainly suggest that if you're looking to display these species that you use a deeper tank, but this was the tank space that we had. We found by experimentation that flat fillets of fishes and squid mantle had a much slower sink rate and thus had a greater availability in terms of the circling of the schooling fishes. And for the smaller tunas that we were working with, 2.5 centimeter to 2 to 4 centimeters seemed to be a relatively ideal size. It floated very well, was suspended in the water column, and then was eaten more readily by the fish than larger pieces. We had good results over time from feeding fully to satiation on a daily basis, which meant that we needed to feed 3 to 4 times a day and offer a variety of foods. It's important to realize that wild-caught tuna may take several days or up to a week to begin to eat supplied foods, and not to get too nervous during that period of time that you are doing something wrong. While their high metabolism will indeed cause some weight loss during this acclimation time, it can be overcome with heavy feedings to satiation after they begin feeding well and accepting food. Unlike the previous situations with head-to-head feeding competition with bonito and larger blackfin tunas and skipjacks, the significant problems that we had with the self-sustained injuries in the holding tank did not occur with the smaller blackfin tunas. We didn't see any of this head-to-head collision or collisions with the side of the tank. But we did have a real big problem with any type of a plumbing penetration in the tank or air stones or any type of projection that projected into that swim path became a site for injury. So we discovered a number of tunas that had one or more bad eyes, so we had to remove all of the plumbing projections in the tank, which presented some immediate problems for us. But once we removed all of those projections and suspended the airlines out of the way, the issue with eye injury almost entirely disappeared. Transport. On November 25th of 2012, we chartered a 747 going to Resorts World Sentosa and completed successful trans-Pacific transport of 12 25 to 30 centimeter juvenile blackfin tunas. This was done from our facility in Marathon, Florida, and was a 45-hour combined ground and air transport from our facility to Singapore. As you can imagine, Singapore is about as far as you can get from Marathon, Florida, so we had a very long trip that ended very well. The transport was accomplished in 4 circular 2.5-meter diameter pelagic sealed transport tanks. The reason that we only use the 2.5-meter diameter tank is this is the largest tank that can really fit very well on a palletized cargo section in any type of cargo aircraft, with the exception perhaps of some of the larger military aircraft. So that's the standard tank that we use because it's the biggest thing we can get on board, and it's the biggest size that is easily manageable to be palletized in a uniform and regular manner. It had a volume of approximately 750 gallons or 3,000 liters, and we used a stocking density of only 3 tuna per tank. Due to changes in regulations surrounding the carriage of compressed oxygen, which came as a bit of a surprise, oxygen can no longer be flowing in flight, departing from or to or over U.S. airspace, so we had to develop a sealed container method that did not involve using oxygen in flight. Any oxygen bottle that may accompany any flight in the U.S., over U.S. airspace, or arriving at U.S. airspace has to be secured, closed, and not functioning during the flight in a specially constructed oxygen containment device that is only manufactured by one facility in the United States, and they were not available at the time that we did this transport. So the way that we handled any potential reoxygenation needs is we staged oxygen cylinders at the refueling points in Anchorage and Nagoya. The sealed container also meant that we had absolutely no ability to access the tuna's containers during transport, nor add Amquel or sodium carbonate to buffer the pH. And this also greatly adds to the difficulty of the process because you have no control during the transport. In previous 747 transport we've done for other facilities, Oceanero, Lisboa, and Valencia as examples, we had 100% access to the tanks all throughout the flight, which made the process much more readily manageable, whereas here we sealed them up and 45 hours later we unsealed the tanks. The outbound temperature of this transport was 27 to 28 degrees centigrade, and this temperature dropped slowly over the course of the flight. As you know, it's cool at 10,000 meters, and we were between 23 and 24 centigrade at landing. During the refueling stops in Anchorage, for example, outside air entered the cabin at minus 10 degrees centigrade, and I have to tell you, my partner Ben, who did the transport, was wearing short pants and sandals during that. And it was also cold at the secondary stop in Nagoya, but with a large container like we had at 3,000 liters, the temperature holds fairly well, and if you look at the fact that we only dropped the maximum about 4 degrees centigrade during a 25 or 28-hour period of time. The water quality was near perfect at departure with pH of 8.2 and ammonia at 0. Upon landing, we had lower pHs at 7.4 to 7.5, which is just fine for a typical transport. And in the 4 individual containers, we had ammonia levels from 0 to 0.017, which of course were well within the standards that the tuna would tolerate. As I mentioned before, we control the ammonia with Amquel as per our normal procedure, but we could only do this at departure and then much later at arrival. On a biomass basis, at 4 to 5 kilograms per tank, the tunas were indeed the lightest stocking density of any animals that we transported on the trip. As a comparison, we also transported on this trip 10 sandbar sharks at 1.8 meters and a biomass of approximately 35 kilograms per tank, or nearly an order of magnitude of greater biomass volume per tank, or the volume of water that was contained inside that tank, and the the oxygen volume. We also transported 1 or 2 eagle rays in the same size tank for a 20-kilogram mass, which represents almost a half an order of magnitude of greater biomass per container, leading us to our opinion that swimming space and water quality was of equal or greater consideration to the successful transport. Now, when we did this transport, we weren't given a lot of advance notice, which is something that we encounter occasionally. So by the time we had finished it and realized that we'd done something that was a little special, it was a little too late to go back and take pictures. So I borrowed some images from our colleagues at Fukushima. This is a tuna transport container for yellowfin tuna, which you can see in the foreground. This fish is about 5 times as big as the fish that we transported, and that's a yellow plasticized rubberized canvas container. We used a very similar technique, except ours was an order of magnitude smaller, and we used large plastic bags, and it did the same thing. But this gives you an idea of how it's done, and again, the fish are never touched by hands or net. Here the gentlemen are lifting them out. We were fortunate enough not to have to use a crane because our fish were so small, so all of the fish that we handled were man-liftable. Or woman-liftable, as the case may be. Whoops. And here's the transport tank. Aquamarine Fukushima has always used rectangular tanks, whereas we've always used circular tanks because we find they work quite a bit better. Here a crane's being used again due to the magnitude of the fish being transported. As you all know, a yellowfin tuna will get up to 100 or 150 kilograms, whereas our tunas will only get to a little over 10 or 12 kilograms. So there's an order of magnitude difference in size, and again making the blackfin tuna an ideal husbandry candidate for smaller aquariums. Here's the offloading process. When you do a 747, you've got a busy day. We had a total of 6 trucks and 25 pallet positions, and you can see in the foreground one of the 2.5-meter diameter tanks where one of our staff is walking around, and this was a very crazy day. It took about 6 hours to offload all the tanks and oxygenate them and prepare them to be ready for transport. The white plastic that you see here on this tank is the secondary containment layer, and it's spilling salt water into the avionics compartment of a $60 million aircraft is definitely a bad idea. Can lead to some interesting aftermath episodes that I'll put a few beers in me, and maybe we'll bring that up later. This is the diagram of the lid itself. This is 2 foam rubber seals, and this seals the oxygen into the container. And what we effect is basically a huge plastic bag. We inject oxygen into the top of the tank and flush out all of the air, and we end up with about 98–99% oxygen above the animals. This is the container that is staged and ready to go onto the aircraft. You see the silver aluminum pallet underneath and the cargo webbing. It's very critical that any type of cargo inside of a cargo aircraft is fully staged and secured. If this cargo was to shift in flight, it's highly likely that the airplane wouldn't make it. As you probably all heard about the recent crash of a 747 in Afghanistan, the loadmaster forgot to secure the cargo. It all shifted the rear of the aircraft and made the aircraft totally unflyable, which is a bad scenario, especially when you have your staff and family on board. Here's 2 1.5-meter diameter tanks staged and strapped, and the only thing remaining to go is the cargo netting. In the background, you see some liquid oxygen tanks that we hoped would be a better solution than high-pressure compressed oxygen, and actually they didn't work very well, though we do use that in our operations at our facility. Whoops, I'm going the right way. Whoops, there we go. There's one of the tuna tanks in the foreground. You can see the large tank on the single pallet position there. And in the back, you can see the remaining tuna tanks in addition to the tanks that held the sandbars, eagle rays, and the other large animals. This is a load nearly ready to go and is representative of about 6 hours of work prior to the flight departure. So anytime a large transport takes place via aircraft, there's a significant amount of time that's involved in getting to the airport, building the cargo to be ready for flight, and getting the various inspections with U.S. Fish and and Wildlife, U.S. Department of Agriculture, and U.S. Customs. During the time that we were doing this, the TSA came in with guns on and parked right in the middle of our staging area and delayed us for about 45 minutes, but in the end it worked out okay. This is the ideal transport vehicle if you've got the client that has the ability to support that. They're wonderful aircraft, extremely dependable. This is a 747-400. This is an L-1011 showing the scissor jack that they use to load it. And this is the interior of a cargo outfitted 747 for those of you who haven't seen it. It's big enough to play football inside until you fill it up with tanks, and all of a sudden it doesn't look all that big. These are 2.5-meter diameter tanks staged side by side, and we can hold a total of about 25 of these in a 747 at one time. We had a combination of 40 tanks total, and you can imagine it was a very busy day for us preparing all of these and getting the water quality parameters perfect in each tank before it was sealed up. And as you can also see, we went from stem to stern, so the entire aircraft was full. It was about 70,000 kilograms of weight in the plane that matched about the same amount of fuel. These are the tanks, 3 of the 4 tuna tanks being offloaded in Singapore. One nice thing about Singapore, it has a wonderful 28-degree temperature year-round, whereas in Florida, we can be as cold as 8 or 9 centigrade during the course of a transport, or we can be as warm as 32. So we do all of our transport in refrigerated trucks that have the ability to modify the temperature to an appropriate level, whereas here in Singapore, that wasn't necessary. Much easier to offload these tanks from the side than it is going out of the back. Out of the back, they can be offloaded 1 at a time. Off the side, they can be offloaded 2, 3 at a time, and it greatly increases the efficiency of the process. Here, the staff at Sentosa was acclimating the animals after the long trip, pumping water from their systems into our transport tanks and vice versa. Here you can see they borrowed one of our colleague Lyle Squire's containers to help us in the acclimation process. And this was literally a Chinese fire drill with a whole bunch of genuine Chinamen, included my son, running around buffering water and getting the ammonia out and bringing the transport water very closely to the specifications of the system water. Here's a release of one of the eagle rays, and again, I'm sorry that we don't have any pictures of the tunas, but in the mad crush of supervising 50 of their staff and opening 40 containers, we just didn't have any time to take any pictures. All of the pictures that were taken here were done by the RWS Sentosa staff, who were kind enough to lend them to us. Here's how we handle another one of the small pelagic fishes that we work with. This is the look-down Selene vomer. And here again, we use no nets. We use plastic tubs or plastic bags to handle these fish because of the very sensitive skin. This is the same way that we handle the tunas. Post-transport captive husbandry. Despite considerable challenges of managing so many sealed containers, we safely landed 11 out of 12 individual tuna into the main display at our client's facility in Singapore. It took dedicated efforts, as you saw, on the part of the receiving facility to get the tunas feeding post-transport in the large confines of the single largest tank in the world. When my guys were there, I asked, well, did you get me some pictures of the tunas? They said, yeah, we did, but they were just little teeny tiny specks, and I looked at them, and it wasn't even worth putting up on the screen. They were so far away. I'm sorry I don't have any images of the fish, but if you ever get to Sentosa, you'll be able to see them. Hopefully they've grown, and not too many of them got eaten up by the larger predators in the tank, which is sometimes problematic for us as well. As we studied later, after verification with various leading experts, including Chuck Forwell at the Monterey Bay Tuna Research and Conservation Center, Dr. Daniel Benetti at the University of Miami Aquaculture Lab, the ICAT Lab in Panama, Toshiki Matsuyama at the Tokyo Sea Life Park, and Ken Fuji and Yoshitaka Abe at Aquamarine Fukushima, this transport was apparently the first air transport of any tuna species that was ever attempted, successfully, if not the sole attempted transport of tunas by air. And I wish I would have known at the time we would have been a little more diligent with photography, and we will do that the next time. It It's our conclusion that small tuna species, such as but not limited to blackfin tuna and little tuna that mature at relatively small sizes, 12 to 15 kilograms total weight as adults, compared to the much larger species like yellowfin tuna, which reach upwards of 125 or 150 kilograms, and bluefin tuna that get significantly larger, have obvious display advantage for facilities with smaller displays. In our subjective opinion, a little bit more work yet needs to be done to fully establish them as viable husbandry candidates, though the preliminary results are looking very promising. And naturally, we did not do this on our own. We had a lot of information shared with us by our various colleagues at Aquamarine Fukushima, Tokyo Sea Life Park, Monterey Bay, and the other individuals listed here. Thank you very much.
Very interesting talk, and it's amazing how these big transports are. At the end, it takes so much effort, but good job. Yeah, well done, well done. Are there any burning questions for this presentation? Otherwise, Forrest will be available in the stands in the commercial exhibit. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Nicole. Thank you again. And thank you also to our colleagues at Berlin, Legoland, and Sea Life for the beautiful facility here.